Hey guys, my paper is about a revisiting of Zeno's paradoxes and evaluating if a contemporary solution that would satisfy us require a modern criteria. And I'm going to offer in the end one solution which I think is probably the most promising of the ones given in the history of philosophy. So who was Zeno? He was a pre-Socratic philosopher, older than Socrates at the time. He was a student of the great Parmenides, who defended a view of an extreme monism, which sublated space, time, plurality, and almost every notion that we have of a common sense view of the world. It was a radical philosophy back in its day and even today, and highly controversial. Parmenides was like the first rationalist philosopher. And Zeno was one of his most devout students and defenders. Zeno wrote a book that contained about 40 paradoxes of plurality, but through secondhand accounts, only about 9 or 10 survive, depending on who you ask. Most of what we know from him comes from Plato's Parmenides, Aristotle's Physics, some historians of philosophers, Neoplatonist commentary that actually borrowed a lot from Zeno because they had very similar conclusions. But basically, everything that we have of Zeno is secondhand. We have no original works. I'm gonna briefly present most of the paradoxes, mostly for completionist purposes. The dichotomy one is one of the more well-known ones, which involves that for any distance you could travel, you first need to travel half that distance and half of that distance and half of that distance. And you could continue this process of division indefinitely. And the idea is that an infinite number of steps should not lead you to reach a finite destination. No person can move an infinite number of steps. In another version of the paradox, the person doesn't even make the first step because any step has the same problem. Notice too that this could also apply to time and duration. Every second you must cross the half-second mark, the quarter-second mark, etc., etc. The other most famous one is the Achilles and the tortoise, which is just a run. It's just a run. And I skipped the slide, but basically, a turtle gets a head start on a run because it's slower. Achilles, the fast runner, will catch up to the turtle, but by the time it catches it, the turtle would have moved a little bit. And you repeat the process. The Achilles catches up to the turtle, and the turtle moves a little more, and a little more, and a little more. And the idea is that Achilles can never catch up to the turtle because every time it does, it will instead have moved a little bit more. Obviously, in real life, races like this happen all the time, well, relatively speaking, and the faster overtakes the slower, so something's going on. Another famous one is the arrow paradox. You shoot an arrow from a bow and it moves a distance, but if you catch the flash points, you freeze time, and you see the arrow at any of these moments, you're gonna find a still arrow. But no matter how many still arrows you add, you'll never get a moving arrow. So what's going on? The moving rows has to do with this image about moving in different directions, and from one perspective you moved one unit, and from another one you moved the second unit, and it's like, how is that possible? Limited and unlimited has to do with the fact that for any discrete quanta, it seems that you have infinite amount of space between two things. So a limited amount of things also implies an unlimited amount of things, and that's a contradiction. The grain has to do with how does a single grain of millet, which doesn't normally make a sound, how does a collection of nothings add up to a something? And the paradox of place has to do with if anything that exists has a place, does a place have a place? And if that does the place of the place have a place? And obviously it's an infinite regress. There are a few others, but basically you get the gist here about what kind of things Zeno is arguing for. The purpose of these, which is often lost, is that these are not individual parlor tricks. These are actually form a constellation arguing for the same thing, which is Parmenides' position. Often when these are tackled individually, this historical point is unfortunately lost. Another thing is, they weren't intended as paradoxes. We call them paradoxes after the fact because our common sense seems to demand that they have a solution. But these are actually arguments. They're reductio ad absurdum. My opponent asserts that plurality is a real thing in the world, or motion is real in the world, or space, or time, or whatever. And you show the contradictions that happen when you accept that, basically arguing for the contrary position. If the many cannot be, it can only be one. So both those factors have to be considered if you're going to give a satisfying solution to the paradox. I'm going to briefly go over the two most famous attempts at solving the paradox. The first one is given in Aristotle's Physics, which is a distinction between actual infinite and potential infinite. The idea is that, for example, in the dichotomy paradox with the half of the halves, this process of endless division is a mental abstraction. It's an imposed potential infinite. But in fact, there is no such thing. Reality is divisible, but it's not really divided. And what we're doing is extending an abstract process indefinitely and treating it as if it's real. And that's what Aristotle thinks the problem arises from. It's a clever objection. But there are a few problems with this attempt at reducing the paradox. One is that it doesn't solve all the paradoxes, like the place of the place paradox is not solved this way, or the stadium necessarily. The issue is also that it's a solution that epistemologizes the question, which is actually the Zeno's point is a metaphysical point, and Aristotle is dividing this idea, we should call it maybe mental space, from real space, whatever that is, and insisting that real space behaves fundamentally different. But it's not clear what divided versus divisible really mean. The capacity to be made of parts seems to be something of space, not something imposed on space. So accepting Aristotle's whole apparatus is not fully satisfying. The modern solution, which is how philosophers today mostly hand-wave the paradoxes, is to say that Zeno didn't have the mathematical apparatus that we have today. We understand now that some series are convergent despite having infinite parts. That is, for example, if I add 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/8 plus 1/16 indefinitely, I still end up with 1. So infinite steps could lead to finite results. And the idea is that Zeno just didn't have that tool to conceptualize this problem. Similarly, integration is like the sum of an area under a curve of increasingly smaller or bigger rectangles. But it's the same idea. Infinite parts could add up to finite wholes. But this misunderstands the problem here. The issue that Zeno poses is that you have plurality and unity existing at once. Not that we lack the heuristic to understand how to make sense of infinite steps make a finite distance, for example. The fact that people do move spaces and that Achilles does beat the turtle kind of already hints that that's not what's really going on. It's more of a solution that an engineer would give to a well-set problem, not a metaphysical response. In fact, both Leibniz, who co-invented calculus, and Whitehead, who was a mathematician and partially a physicist, understood that the calculus solution is incomplete. Zeno's paradox is a metaphysical position. It needs a metaphysical answer. Even if it's to deny metaphysics itself, even that is a metaphysical solution. Also, it doesn't solve all the paradoxes, like the paradox of place. So what should a solution have? First, it has to take Parmenides seriously. It either has to affirm the reality of what Zeno denies, or agree with Zeno and Parmenides and be a monist of their fashion, or maybe agree with the conclusion but disagree that the argument works. It would need to also answer the paradoxes as a set and not as individual parlor tricks. That is, to honor the historical point of the paradoxes and to realize that their strength lies in their unity. They're all pointing at the same thing. Also, ideally, a contemporary solution would take seriously the physics of today. It seems that the calculus solution, which is so popular, is still stuck in the days of Newtonian mechanics. So this is what I think is the most promising solution. The metaphysician Samuel Alexander came up with a very creative metaphysical system that he elaborated in his book Space-Time and Deity. He's famous for saying time is the mind of space. He wrote this in 1920, but he saw the writing on the wall, which was relativity theory, with its promise of uniting space and time as indispensable cofactors instead of different dimensions, is the way forward, and it will inform a new ontology. Philosophy has operated like it's still stuck in Newtonian mechanics 200 years ago. It's time to move forward. For Alexander, motion becomes a unit, a basic unit, because space-time, singular, is the ultimate unit of reality. And what we think of as little things are actually little motions of one big, quote-unquote, living motion. Its position is called supersubstantivism because it treats matter not as something inside space and time, but matter is perturbations in space-time. It's an identity, not a set belonging or a containment. There's one way he phrases it. Without time as a cofactor, different points in space are mere coordinates of blanks. Without space as a cofactor, time is a mere unending now with no succession. It's time to upgrade our metaphysics with what the best physics of our time, 1920 then, but even today for the most part, what relativity is telling us. We can't separate time and space. Basically, what we call motion cannot be treated as two different dimensions but one. So instead of points and instants, we're talking about a metaphysics of point instants. That means every unit has extension and duration. Alexander's response to Zeno is threefold. One is that the paradox, the contradiction of unity and plurality is caused by artificially stripping time from space and space from time. Place is treated as also as an independent real of that which is in places. The relation is one of identity, like I mentioned. And three, all these thought experiments that Zeno is doing always treat as hypothesis the quanta of a given distance, a given duration of arrow, a given space of arrow moving, or things like that, almost as a provisional ultimate. But we know even these are also subsets. And the issue is that Zeno always wants to insist that the finite quanta is both an ultimate and a subordinate, when in fact it is not the case. You have to bite the bullet. Reality really is one. But unlike Zeno, who wants to say that space and time are subordinate appearances, Alexander absolutizes space and time. So let's see briefly how those would work. Against the dichotomy paradox, each newer half that's being added up, trying to get to the one distance, it's not a mere point, but they're point instants. So there's no risk of an addition of mere blanks to, as each point distance carries both extension and duration. In the Achilles and Turtles thought experiment, they're both participating in one larger motion. The paradox only arises when you treat the turtle's path and Achilles' path as two different motions. If you treat them as one and then you add velocity, the paradox is solved. The arrow one also happens because of missing the point of the point instant. Each snapshot of the arrow is just space stripped of time. If you add the duration girth of the arrow, you can, by adding them up, get motion, which is the whole point. I'm not gonna go over all of them, but similarly with the limited and unlimited paradox, the error is that you're sneaking in a discrete quanta and treat it in as ultimate. But Alexander will tell you, bite the bullet. Reality really is just one. In this case, it would be unlimited. And yes, every finite motion would have one and many, but this is a feature, not a bug, because the continuum is the only thing that's real. And finally, the place paradox also gets dissolved because place and what the place contains are one and the same. There's no real distinction in which you will need to then place the place of the place somewhere. Once you have identity, the paradox dissolves. Basically, as you could see, you could tackle all the paradoxes at once, as probably Zeno would have wanted, if you were going to successfully answer to him. You're not picking them one by one and trying to find some clever error. And I think this is the one that honors our modern science the most. So it satisfies our criteria. He's taking Zeno's challenge seriously. He's responding to them as a set. And even though his method is mostly a priori, he's being informed by the latest science of his day. This is why I think this is probably the best solution we have to the paradoxes. Not the only one, but maybe the most promising. Thank you.